Welcome to The Last ETR NTY. Subscribe now so you don't miss more videos like this one. The sinister story of Civil War soldiers. What they found in the desolate wilderness of the Appalachians. Like a wet shroud, the mist clung to the jagged peaks, refusing to let the morning sun touch the valley floor. Before we dive into this story, drop a comment right now telling us where you're listening from. What city? What state? What country? We love knowing who's out there with us tonight. Now, let's go back to 1865. In March of 1865, the Appalachian Mountains were a place where the echoes of the Civil War began to fade into a much older, much deeper silence of the earth. Toward its inevitable conclusion, in the lowlands, the great conflict was bleeding. But up here, amidst the borderlands of West Virginia and Tennessee, the struggles of North and South felt like the petty squabbles of children compared to the ancient, indifferent weight of the stone and timber. Through a landscape that seemed to have forgotten the existence of civilization, Sergeant Elias Croft led his small four-man detachment. In the fires of Antietam and Gettysburg, Croft, at 38, was a man forged, a map of scars and weariness his face, his eyes hardened into flint. Not with pride, but with a grim, practiced necessity, he carried the heavy burden of command, knowing that the survival of his men depended entirely on his ability to remain unmoved by the encroaching shadows of the wilderness. Thick with the smell of damp pine and the sharp, metallic tang of an approaching storm the air was. Behind Croft trudged Private Thomas Hale, a 19-year-old boy from the rural pastures of Pennsylvania, who looked as though he had aged a decade in the last 3 weeks. Hale was the heart of the group, or what was left of it, still possessing a sliver of the innocence that the war had tried so hard to extinguish. A son of the soil he was, a farmhand who understood the language of crops and seasons. Yet, as they pushed deeper into the dense thickets of the high ridges, he found himself unable to translate the omens of this place. He was the first to notice that the birds had stopped singing miles ago. By an oppressive, heavy stillness that felt as though the very atmosphere was holding its breath, the usual chatter of the forest, the scolding of squirrels, the rustle of small game, had been replaced. To their left, Corporal Silas Webb maintained a steady, rhythmic pace, his mind clearly elsewhere. A former school teacher from Ohio, Webb was 34, and through the cold, unyielding lens of rationalism he viewed the world. Even in the midst of a brutal war, he had clung to his books and his logic, convinced that with enough observation and intellect every mystery of the universe could be unraveled. Perpetually clouded by the mountain humidity, he adjusted his spectacles and muttered about the geological composition of the limestone cliffs surrounding them. For Webb, the unease hanging over the squad was merely the result of fatigue, malnutrition, and the psychological strain of a long campaign. As a simple biological reaction to isolation, he dismissed the creeping dread, a theory he shared loudly whenever the silence became too heavy to bear. Bringing up the rear was Jed Monroe. Jed was a man of shadows, a Southerner who had once worn the gray of the Confederacy before deserting and finding his way into the Union ranks. In a way the others never could. He knew the Appalachians, having been raised in the dark hollows and forgotten gaps of the southern range. Like a second skin, he carried with him the superstitions and folklore of his people. While Webb looked at the rocks and Croft looked at the trail, Jed looked at the gaps between the trees. With a quiet, predatory grace he moved, his fingers often tracing the air, as if feeling for a change in the wind. He spoke the least, but saw the most. And as they ascended into the higher altitudes, where the hemlocks grew tall and black, his hand stayed perpetually near the hammer of his rifle. Slow and grueling was the march into the darkness of the gorge. a labyrinth of deep ravines and treacherous, rain-slicked slopes that threatened to snap a man's ankle with every misstep the terrain was. As the day progressed, the fog did not dissipate. Instead, it seemed to thicken, swirling around their legs like a living thing, obscuring the ground and distorting their sense of distance. On the back of his neck, Croft felt a prickling sensation, a phantom heat that suggested eyes were fixed upon them from the high ridges above. He didn't speak of it, maintaining the rigid discipline of a soldier. But he noticed that even the wind had a different quality here. It didn't howl so much as it whispered, a low, sibilant sound that mimicked the cadence of human speech. By mid-afternoon, the squad reached the banks of a narrow, churning mountain river. Black and ice-cold the water was, fed by the melting snows of the higher peaks. As they paused to refill their canteens, Hale let out a sharp, stifled gasp. Toward a soft patch of dark silt at the water's edge, he pointed. There, pressed deep into the mud, were a series of tracks. They were not the prints of a bear, nor were they the heavy, treated marks of a soldier's boot. Wide, elongated impressions they were, possessing a terrifyingly large gap between the toes and a total lack of a human heel structure. From the water they emerged and led straight into an impenetrable wall of rhododendron thickets, appearing as though something had walked calmly out of the depths and disappeared into the brush. By the prints, Croft knelt, his heart thudding against his ribs. Fresh the tracks were, the water still seeping into the depressions. They were being watched, not by a lingering enemy scout, but by something that belonged to the mountains themselves. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. The sinister story of Civil War soldiers. What they found in the desolate wilderness of the Appalachians. Before we dive into this story, drop a comment right now telling us where you're listening from. What city? What state? What country? We love knowing who's out there with us tonight. Now let's go back to 1865. More deafening than any cannon fire Sergeant Elias Croft had ever endured was the silence that followed the discovery of the tracks. Slowly he stood, his joints protesting against the damp mountain air, and looked toward the wall of green, where the strange impressions vanished. No rustle of leaves was there, no snapping of twigs, just a heavy, stagnant peace that felt entirely artificial. He could see the pulse hammering in Private Hale's neck, the young man's skin turning a waxy, sickly pale. Croft didn't offer words of comfort. In this wilderness, comfort was a lie that could get a man killed. He simply signaled for the squad to shoulder their packs and move away from the water. Upward they climbed, leaving the Black River behind. But the sensation of being observed did not dissipate. It felt as though the very trees were leaning in, their gnarled branches reaching out to snag the wool of their tattered blue uniforms. As the afternoon light began to fail, bleeding into a bruised purple hue behind the heavy clouds, the squad crested a jagged limestone ridge and found themselves staring down into a hidden hollow. In the center of a small, bowl-shaped valley nestled the remains of a settlement. It was a cluster of perhaps 6 or 7 log cabins, their timber grayed and skeletal from years of exposure. These were not the charred ruins of a war-torn village. No scorch marks from Confederate torches were there, nor were there signs of a siege. Instead, the buildings looked as if they had simply been surrendered to the earth. Under the weight of winter snows, roofs had collapsed, and thick, strangling vines of ivy had wound themselves through the windows like the fingers of a drowning man. Colder here the air was, trapped by the surrounding cliffs, and it carried a faint, cloying scent of wet ash and stagnant water. With his rifle leveled, Croft led them down the slope. Against the treacherous, loose stone, every step was a gamble. When they reached the perimeter of the clearing, Corporal Silas Webb immediately broke formation to inspect a hand-carved wooden bucket left sitting on a porch. Half filled with rainwater and dead insects it was, but the wood was not yet fully rotted. Webb pushed his spectacles up the bridge of his nose, his analytical mind struggling to reconcile the state of the objects with the oppressive atmosphere. He noted a child's rag doll lying in the dirt, its button eyes missing, and a heavy iron kettle still hanging over a cold hearth. To Webb, it looked like a sudden exodus. A community that had fled in the middle of a meal, leaving behind the precious tools of survival. About a possible smallpox outbreak, or a sudden threat from a marauding band of bushwhackers, he began to murmur, his voice trembling slightly as he sought a logical anchor for the scene. Jedediah Monroe, however, did not look at the tools. To the doorframe of the largest cabin he walked and stopped, his eyes fixed on the lintel. There, deep gouges had been carved into the wood. Strange, interlocking geometric patterns that resembled stars with too many points. Grim Jed's face went, his weathered features hardening into a mask of recognition. From cabin to cabin he moved, finding the same symbols etched over every entrance and even into the bark of the ancient oaks that stood guard over the clearing. Not the markings of a literate man these were. They were wards, ancient sigils of protection used by those who lived so far from God's light that they had to invent their own ways to keep the darkness at bay. With a shaking finger, Jed traced the lines, whispering a prayer in a dialect the others couldn't quite follow. He knew these signs meant that the people here hadn't been running from a disease. Against something that didn't need a key, they had been trying to bar the door. Despite the obvious omens, the sun was disappearing fast, and the mountain fog was rolling in like a thick white tide. To stay in the open would be suicide in this terrain. Croft made the executive decision to hole up in the most intact cabin, a structure that felt slightly more solid than the others. Inside they moved, the floorboards groaning under their boots like a living thing in pain. A tomb of shadows the interior was. In the weak light of their single lantern, dust danced, settling on a table where a crust of bread had long since turned to stone. Small and narrow the windows were, offering little view of the encroaching night. Croft assigned watches, placing Hale by the door and Webb by the rear window, while Jed sat in the center of the room, his eyes closed, his lips moving in a silent, frantic rhythm. Transformation to the Appalachians the night brought. The wind didn't just blow, it seemed to mourn, whistling through the gaps in the logs with a sound that mimicked a human flute. In a tense, vibrating silence hours passed, until Thomas Hale suddenly stiffened. Against the door he leaned his head, his eyes wide with a terror that bypassed reason. For the others to listen, he gestured. At first, there was nothing but the wind, but then, rising from the darkness of the woods, came a sound that chilled Croft to his very marrow. It wasn't a roar or the cry of a predator. A voice, it was low, rhythmic, and impossibly deep. A repetitive pattern it hummed, a series of guttural vibrations that felt as though they were being felt in the chest, rather than heard in the ears. Ancient and hypnotic the chanting was, coming from every direction at once. Silas Webb tried to speak, his mouth opening to suggest it was the wind rushing through a hollow log or a trick of the mountain's acoustics. But the words died in his throat. Louder the chanting grew, a steady, pulsing cadence that seemed to be counting the seconds of their lives. It was the sound of the Watcher, the guardian of the ridges, acknowledging their presence. In the dark they sat, rifles gripped so tightly their knuckles turned white, watching the door as the rhythmic humming vibrated through the very foundations of the cabin. They didn't sleep. Heavily, they didn't even dare to breathe. For the dawn they simply waited, wondering if the wards on the door would be enough to keep the singer outside. No longer just the absence of light the darkness was. A weight it had become, a physical entity that pressed against the walls, testing the strength of the rotted wood and the resolve of the 4 men trapped within. Not so much light the gray dawn brought as it diluted the heavy shadows of the long night. Exactly 4 minutes before the first hint of sun touched the high ridges, the rhythmic chanting had ceased, leaving a silence so absolute it felt like a physical weight against the eardrums. By the door, Sergeant Elias Croft sat, his eyes bloodshot, and his rifle still resting across his weary knees. In what felt like hours, he had not blinked. To the breaking point, his senses strained. Beside him, Private Thomas Hale was a ghost of a man, his youthful face pinched and aged by the terror of the dark hours. The night they had survived, but as the visibility slowly increased, the realization set in that the cabin offered no true sanctuary. Stagnant the air remained, smelling of wet cedar, old ash, and the cold, metallic tang of human fear. Croft stood up, his joints popping like dry kindling in the absolute stillness. "Check your gear," he commanded, his voice raspy and thin. A tether to reality, the simple military routine was a way to reclaim their identity as soldiers. But as the men began to inspect their kits, that tether snapped. Corporal Silas Webb, who had spent the night muttering formulas and logical proofs to himself, let out a sharp, strangled gasp. No longer under his head was his haversack, which he had used as a makeshift pillow. Perfectly upright in the center of the dusty floorboards, it sat 3 feet away. He had not felt it move, and he had not heard a single rustle of fabric during his long, wide-eyed vigil. "I didn't touch it," Hale whispered, backing away from the bag as if it were a coiled viper ready to strike. "I didn't move an inch, Sergeant. I swear by the Almighty, I didn't close my eyes for a second." Croft did not answer immediately. To his own pack, which had been leaned against the far wall, he walked over. His tin cup, which had been tied securely to the leather strap with a double knot, was now resting on the table, next to a piece of petrified bread. Not been cut, the knot had. With surgical precision it had been untied and left in a perfect coil on the wood. Not from the mountain air was the cold that seeped into Croft's bones then. It was the realization that, while they had been staring at the door and windows, something had been inside the room with them, moving between their very breaths. Jedediah Monroe did not join the check of equipment. At the wall behind the cold hearth he was staring. The color of wood ash his face was. "Sergeant," he said, his voice a mere thread of sound. "Look at the chimney." Holding his breath, Croft approached the wall. There, etched into the soot, stained wood of the interior chimney breast, was the same interlocking star symbol they had seen on the outside lintels. Fresh it was. Still pale and bright against the darkened timber, the wood shavings were. This very wall Jed had inspected the night before while looking for drafts to block. Bare, smooth, and untouched it had been. "It is a claim," Jed whispered, his eyes darting to the shadowed corners. "It is not just to keep things out anymore. To mark what is already inside it is. We have been counted, Sergeant." Already brittle, Silas Webb's rationalism began to shatter like glass. The small room he began to pace, his boots thudding unevenly. "It was one of us," he insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. Dormant psychological states the stress of the campaign triggers. In a fugue, one of us moved the items. In a fit of deluded hysteria, one of us carved that mark. For such a localized phenomenon, it is the only logical explanation. Jedediah did not even look at him. "I do not carry a knife that sharp, Silas," he countered, "and neither do you. Look at the depth of the groove." By a man shivering in the dark, that was not done. Croft did not let the argument escalate. Enough. We are leaving. Pack the rations. We move out now. Their packs they shouldered, the weight feeling twice as heavy as it had the day before. Out of the cabin and into the swirling white curtain of the morning mist Croft led them. Oppressive the atmosphere was, the fog clinging to their wool coats like damp hands. Toward the slope they had descended the previous evening they moved, intending to backtrack to the river. But as they reached the edge of the clearing, Croft stopped. His compass he checked, but the needle spun lazily, refusing to settle. For the jagged limestone outcrop that had served as their landmark, he searched. Gone it was. Where there should have been a steep, rocky incline and the traces of their own footprints, there was only a wall of impenetrable rhododendron and ancient, gnarled laurel. Like a wound healing in an instant, the forest had closed behind them. Gone the path was. To have shifted the very topography of the mountain seemed, the ridges folding in on themselves to create a labyrinth with no exit. The trail. Hale started, his voice cracking. Sergeant, where is the trail? Webb scrambled forward, his hands clawing at the thick waxy leaves. Here it has to be. Erosion or perhaps a small landslide during the night must have covered it. Our perception the mist is distorting. Hyperventilating he was, his fingers trembling as he tried to find a gap in the vegetation. None there was. Dense and seemingly decades old the growth was. Trapped in the hollow they were, held fast by a geography that refused to obey the laws of nature. To the center of the settlement they retreated, standing in a circle as the mist pressed in closer, erasing the cabins. It was then that Jedediah Monroe sat down on a rotted stump. With wary resignation he looked at the others. You want to know what is happening, Silas? My granddaddy told me about this place. The Watcher's Ground, he called it. Against a porch railing Croft leaned. Tell us, Jed. No more riddles. Into the fog staring, Jed began to speak. The folks who lived here did not leave because of the war. Because the Watcher of the Ridges grew tired of their noise they left. Not a ghost it is. The mountain itself given a shape and a mind it is. For meat it does not hunt. For spirit it tests. It watches, and it sees what a man is made of when the path disappears. His voice dropping to a low murmur, Jed continued. Some it lets go, they say. The ones who show respect. But the ones who try to fight the mountain just become part of the woods. To Whitestone their bones turn, and their breath becomes the fog. Hale whimpered, and even Webb could not find the words to protest. At his men Croft looked. In Hale he saw the terror, and in Webb the burgeoning madness. We move, Croft said. We do not fight the woods. We walk until we find a gap, or until the Watcher decides we have seen enough. Deeper into the heart of the hollow they began to walk, following the only direction the mountain allowed. Like an intrusion every step felt, and high above them, hidden by the gray canopy, the Watcher continued its silent vigil. The sinister story of Civil War soldiers. What they found in the desolate wilderness of the Appalachians. Not merely secrets the mountains hold. Into the ears of those who dare to wander too far, from the light of the campfire they breathe them. Before we dive into this story, drop a comment right now telling us where you're listening from. What city? What state? What country? We love knowing who's out there with us tonight. Now, let's go back to 1865. Into a blur of gray mist and jagged stone, the trek through the suffocating density of the Appalachian wilderness had become. For 2 days, Sergeant Elias Croft and his 3 men had been walking in circles that were not circles, tracing the edges of a reality that refused to stay fixed. No longer a collection of trees and soil the woods were. A living, breathing labyrinth designed to disorient and diminish the human spirit they had become. Every time Croft checked his compass, the needle mocked him, spinning with a frantic rhythmic energy that suggested the very magnetic poles had abandoned this hollow. Thick the air was, smelling of ancient rot and something metallic, like the scent of a blade being sharpened on a whetstone. In a single file they moved, the silence between them heavier than the packs on their backs. So violently Private Thomas Hale was trembling that the brass buttons on his jacket rattled like dry bones. Behind him, Corporal Silas Webb had stopped trying to explain the shifting landscape. Bloodshot and wide the former teacher's eyes were, his lips moving in a silent prayer, or perhaps a series of mathematical proofs that no longer added up in this God-forsaken place. Jedediah Monroe, the man who knew the legends, walked with his head bowed, his hand never straying far from the iron knife at his belt. In these heights, he knew, iron was often more important than lead. On the afternoon of the third day, the dense canopy of laurel and oak suddenly surrendered. Into a wide, unnatural clearing the men stumbled. Thinner here the mist was, clinging to the ground like a white shroud, revealing a formation that made Croft's blood turn to ice. In the center of the clearing stood a structure that defied military or architectural logic, a primitive, towering spire made of interlocking branches, river stones, and artifacts that did not belong to the natural world. It was. As they drew closer, the details became agonizingly clear. Not a shelter this was. An altar of memory it was. Into the gray wood were woven items from another life. Atop a jagged branch sat a Union forage cap, bleached white by years of exposure. Below it, deep into a pile of stones, a rusted cavalry saber was driven. Letters there were, their ink long faded into illegible smudges. Tied to the structure with locks of human hair, a soft whimpering sound Hale let out as he pointed to a row of brass buttons, pinned to a strip of rotted leather. To the ones on their own uniforms they were identical, yet a century old they looked. A collection of things lost. This was a monument to those who had been swallowed by the ridges before them. No signs of a struggle were there, no splashes of old blood on the stones. Only the quiet, terrifying evidence of disappearance there was. "A counting house it is," Jedediah whispered, his voice cracking. "Not just observe the watcher does. It collects. The things that define a man it takes until there is nothing left but the shadow." Silas Webb stepped forward, his rational mind finally snapping under the weight of the impossible. Toward a silver locket hanging from a protruding twig, he reached out a trembling hand. "Not real this is," he hissed, his voice rising to a frantic pitch. "A hallucination brought on by exhaustion and dampness. It's a trick of the light. This structure is a localized phenomenon of the mountain air." Intending to tear it away to prove its insubstantiality, he grabbed the locket, but as his fingers closed around the metal, he froze. Across his face a look of absolute, soul-shattering horror crossed. He didn't scream. To his knees he simply collapsed, his hands dropping to his sides as the locket swung gently, undisturbed. "Thomas?" Croft barked, sensing the shift in the air. "Get him up. We are leaving now." But Hale did not move. Past the structure toward the northern edge of the clearing, where the forest resumed its impenetrable wall, he was staring. Ghostly pale his face was, his eyes fixed on a shadow that was darker than the rest. There, standing perfectly still between two ancient hemlocks, was a figure. Tall it was, impossibly thin, and draped in tatters of gray cloth that seemed to bleed into the mist. No discernible face it had, only a suggestion of features beneath a hood of woven moss. It did not move, it did not breathe. Simply it stood, a silent sentinel watching the invaders of its sanctuary. Not like facing an enemy soldier the presence of the watcher was. No heat of anger was there, no surge of adrenaline. Instead, there was a cold, crushing weight that settled in the center of Croft's chest. a realization that utterly insignificant in the eyes of this ancient thing they were. The mountain the figure was, and the figure was the mountain. In that moment, Croft understood the bargain that had to be made. For what they were, he saw the items on the spire, tolls paid for a passage that was never guaranteed. "Drop your kits," Croft commanded, his voice sounding hollow and strange in his own ears. "Sergeant," Monroe asked, his eyes darting from the figure to Croft. "The rations, the extra boots, the medals. Leave them," Croft clears throat ordered, his hand moving to the pocket of his vest. A heavy silver watch he pulled out, a gift from his father before the Maryland campaign. The only thing of value he owned it was. With a steady hand, he walked to the base of the spire and placed the watch on a flat stone. Following his lead, the others began to shed their burdens. His canteen and a small Bible hail dropped. Even the broken web fumbled with his brass compass, laying it in the dirt with a trembling hand. Of their attachments to the world of men, they stripped themselves, offering their prized possessions to the silent guardian of the ridges. Croft didn't wait to see if the figure approved. By the collar of his coat, he grabbed Webb and hauled him upright. "We walk," Croft whispered, never taking his eyes off the shadow between the trees. "We walk and we do not look back. If we stop, we become part of the spire." Away from the clearing they backed. Slow and deliberate their movements were, like men retreating from a sleeping predator. As they crossed the threshold back into the dense trees, Hale stole one last glance toward the hemlocks. Gone the figure was. In its place was only the swirling mist and the absolute, terrifying silence of the heights. Still unknown the path ahead was, but for the first time in days, the air felt a fraction lighter, as if the mountain had momentarily exhaled, allowing them one final chance to escape the green throat of the wilderness. Into the deepening gloom they turned and fled, leaving their history behind them on the altar of the Watcher. The sinister story of Civil War soldiers, what they found in the desolate wilderness of the Appalachians. Before we dive into this story, drop a comment right now telling us where you're listening from. What city? What state? What country? We love knowing who's out there with us tonight. Now, let's go back to 1865. Into the gray veil of the mist the clearing receded, but the image of the spire remained burned into the backs of their eyelids. With a frantic, stumbling urgency they moved, their boots slipping on the rain, slicked shale, and the rotting carpets of ancient needles. Their pace swifter the weight they had shared at the base of that ritualistic structure should have made. Yet every man felt a peculiar phantom heaviness dragging at his limbs, as if by surrendering their earthly possessions. The watches, the letters, the brass buttons of their service. They had also surrendered a piece of their own gravity it was. Blindly Sergeant Elias Croft led them, his hand gripping the cold iron of his rifle with a white, knuckled intensity that was more habit than hope. He did not look back. If he turned his head, even for a fleeting second, he knew he might see that impossibly thin, gray, draped figure standing right behind him, its moss-woven hood leaning close to whisper a secret that would surely undo his mind. Denser the forest grew, the trees twisting into agonized shapes that seemed to reach out and snag at their tattered wool uniforms. To locals as a laurel hell, this was the territory known, a sprawling, impenetrable thicket of mountain laurel so tightly woven that a man could walk for hours and never touch the actual ground, trapped instead in a cage of gnarled wood and suffocating leaves. Stagnant the air here was, smelling of deep earth and something metallic, like the scent of an old penny resting on a dead tongue. Hyperventilating Private Thomas Hale was, his breaths coming in ragged, shallow gulps that echoed too loudly in the oppressive dampness. On the center of Croft's back, he kept his eyes fixed, terrified that if he blinked, the sergeant would vanish into the fog, leaving him alone in the green throat of the ridge. On the nape of his neck, Hale felt a prickly sensation, the unmistakable feeling of a predatory gaze, tracking his every movement, measuring the tempo of his heartbeat against the ticking clock of the wilderness. Beside him, Corporal Silas Webb was a shell of a man, into a void that no equation could fill. The former teacher, who had once prided himself on his ability to categorize the world into neat columns of logic and reason, was now staring. Empty his hands were, his fingers twitching rhythmically, as if he were still trying to grasp the silver locket he had left behind on the stone altar. A glazed, hollow look in his eyes, there was a profound disconnection from the reality of the trail. Not out of a will to survive, he followed the group, but because the momentum of the march was the only thing left to him. The most terrifying thing of all, Webb's silence was the silence of a man who had looked behind the curtain of the world and found nothing but a cold, observant eye. It was. No longer he questioned the shifting geography or the impossible shadows. Simply, he had accepted that the rules of the civilized world had been revoked the moment they crossed the first ridge. With a different kind of intensity, Jedediah Monroe moved. The only one who seemed to understand the gravity of the bargain they had just struck. He was. Bodie kept his head, his lips moving in a silent, frantic recitation of old mountain charms and half-remembered prayers. To Jed, not a ghost or a hallucination the Watcher was, but a fundamental force of the Appalachians, as real as the granite peaks and the rushing white water of the gorges. More than just tolls, he knew that the items they had left behind were anchors. They were. By leaving their things, they had hoped to buy back their souls, but a greedy creditor the mountain was. Never from the hilt of his iron knife did Jed's hand leave, his knuckles bruised and blue from the cold. In these ancient places, he knew, iron was the only thing that held any authority over the shadows, a thin line of protection between the living and the things that had forgotten how to die. Its slow descent, the sun, if it existed at all behind the iron, gray clouds began, and the light in the laurel hell turned a bruised, sickly purple. Not just grow longer, the shadows did. They seemed to detach themselves from the trees, creeping across the forest floor like spilled ink. For a halt, Croft called, not because he wanted to rest, but because too treacherous to navigate in the fading light the terrain had become. Together they huddled in a small depression beneath a jutting rock overhang, their bodies pressed close for warmth. No blankets, no fire, and no food they had. A dull ache in their bellies the hunger was, but by a far more visceral knowing, it was eclipsed. The hunger for a single sound that wasn't the wind or the creaking of the timber. Unnaturally quiet, the forest was a vacuum of noise that made the sound of their own blood rushing in their ears seem deafening. As the darkness solidified, the psychological pressure reached a breaking point. Like a deliberate provocation, every snap of a twig, every rustle of a dry leaf felt. Against the cold stone, Croft sat with his back, his eyes scanning the perimeter of their makeshift camp. Most acutely now, he felt the absence of his father's watch. A fluid, terrifying thing time had become, stretching and compressing without any external measure. For days or for centuries, he wondered if they had been in these mountains. Still happening, he wondered if the war was, or if the world they had come from had simply crumbled into dust while they were busy negotiating with the Watcher. Absolute the isolation was. No longer soldiers of the Union they were, merely four small, flickering sparks of life in a vast, indifferent ocean of ancient stone and whispering wood they were. Fragile the agreement they had made in the clearing felt. A temporary reprieve that could be revoked at any moment if they failed to show the proper deference to the guardian of the ridges. For the moon to rise, they waited, praying that the light would bring some form of clarity, yet fearing what the illumination might actually reveal hiding in the periphery of their vision. The sinister story of Civil War soldiers. What they found in the desolate wilderness of the Appalachians. Like a wounded beast, the wind howled through the jagged peaks, carrying the scent of damp earth and ancient, forgotten secrets into the lungs of the exhausted men. Before we dive into this story, drop a comment right now telling us where you're listening from. What city? What state? What country? We love knowing who's out there with us tonight. Now, let's go back to 1865. A physical weight, the darkness beneath the rock overhang, was pressing against their chests until every breath felt like an act of defiance against the mountain itself. In the deep, suffocating hollows of the Appalachians, no longer representatives of a grand cause, the four soldiers were. Huddled animals they were, stripped of the machinery of war and the certainty of their mission. Wide Sergeant Elias Croft kept his eyes, straining to see through the impenetrable curtain of the night. The others he could hear. The wet, ragged hitch in Thomas Hale's breathing, the rhythmic clicking of Silas Webb's teeth, and the low, barely audible murmur of Jedediah Monroe's prayers. In their proximity, no comfort was. Instead, to amplify their shared terror seemed a cold current passing between their touching shoulders. Not merely a backdrop for their journey, the mountains were. An active participant they had become, a silent, stony witness to their slow unraveling. In the soles of their boots, before it ever reached their ears, it began as a vibration. Not the wind it was, which had died down to a deceptive, haunting stillness. A sound that defied the natural order of the forest. It was a low, rhythmic cadence that lacked the sharp edges of human speech, but possessed a terrifyingly intentional structure. The sound of a voice it was, or perhaps 1,000 voices layered into a single droning hum, echoing from the deep throat of the gorge below them. Hail, wind. A small, pathetic sound of a boy who had seen too much. And Croft reached out to grip the lad's shoulder, his fingers digging into the thin wool of his coat. They did not speak. To acknowledge that the sound was real was to speak, and to invite it closer was to acknowledge it. Corporal Silas Webb, once the arbiter of logic and a man of letters, simply stared into the blackness, his eyes unblinking. For an explanation he was no longer looking. For the inevitable he was waiting. Toward the Sergeant Jedediah Monroe leaned, his voice a ghost of a whisper that barely carried over the mountain's drone. Of the watcher of the ridges he spoke, not as a story told by firelight to frighten children, but as a warning carved into the very bones of the people who lived in these hidden, mist-choked hollows. Of entities that had walked these trails before the first axe ever struck a tree, he whispered. Beings who did not understand the concept of borders, states, or wars, only the sanctity of the high, cold places. According to the mountain folk Jed had encountered in his youth, with tooth or claw the watcher did not hunt. With the mind it hunted, peeling away the layers of a man's sanity until there was nothing left but the raw, shivering core of his soul. Leaving the items they had left at the stone structure were an ancient gesture of appeasement, meant to signal that they were merely passing through. Yet Jed's trembling hands suggested that for their safe passage the price might not have been sufficient. As the gray, sickly light of a pre-dawn fog began to seep into their crevice, the true horror of their situation became apparent. Gone the trail they had followed to reach this shelter was. In its place stood a wall of rhododendron and mountain laurel, so thick it looked as though it had been growing there for decades. During the night, the very geography of the ridge had altered, as if the mountain had breathed and shifted its weight while they were paralyzed by fear. Croft stood, his joints popping with a sound like pistol shots in the silence. At his men he looked. Gaunt their faces were, their eyes shadowed by a wariness that went deeper than physical exhaustion. In a labyrinth of green and gray they were trapped, a vertical wilderness that seemed determined to swallow them whole. Then the sergeant realized they weren't just lost. Curated they were being, moved like pieces on a board by a hand they could not see and a will they could not comprehend. Silas Webb was the first to break the morning silence, but not with words of comfort or tactical advice. To laugh he began, a soft, dry sound that rattled in his throat, like dead leaves skittering across a grave. Toward a nearby tree he pointed, where a fresh symbol had been carved into the dark bark. The same jagged mark Jed had identified earlier it was, but still weeping sap this one was, the wood beneath the cut pale and raw. When they huddled down the night before it hadn't been there. Inches from them, while they slept, someone or something had stood, marking the boundary of their new prison. A surge of cold fury Croft felt, a desperate need to reclaim his authority, but no enemy to shoot was there, no officer to report to. Only the mist, the trees, and the crushing weight of the Appalachians there was. Again they began to move, but a clumsy, desperate progress it was. A cage of gnarled wood, the laurel hell, was that snagged at their clothes and scratched at their skin like tiny wooden fingers. Every few yards, another sign of the watcher's presence they found. A brass button from Hale's jacket, which he hadn't even realized was missing, was found sitting perfectly balanced on top of a mossy stone 10 yards from where they had slept. Later, Webb found his own spectacles, which he thought were tucked securely in his pocket, hanging from a high branch well out of reach. With them the watcher was playing, demonstrating a terrifying level of intimacy and access to their most private spaces. Unbearable the psychological toll was becoming. No longer a place of trees and soil the forest was, but a vast, living entity that was slowly digesting them. At the sky Croft looked, but so thick the canopy was that nothing more than a pale, indifferent smudge the sun was. Further into the green throat of the ridge they were descending, and with every step, more like a dream that was rapidly fading into the mist the world they once knew felt. The sinister story of Civil War soldiers, what they found in the desolate wilderness of the Appalachians. Secrets the mountains hold that the history books were too afraid to write, secrets buried under layers of mist and the blood of those who wandered too far from the trail. Before we dive into this story, drop a comment right now telling us where you're listening from. What city? What state? What country? We love knowing who's out there with us tonight. Now, let's go back to 1865. Not a journey of miles the descent from the rock overhang was, but a slide into a fever dream where by an ancient hand the laws of nature were being rewritten. The way Sergeant Elias Croft led, his saber now used as a machete to hack through the interlocking branches of the laurel hell. Like the breaking of a bone in the oppressive silence, every snap of a twig sounded, of ancient rot and something metallic. The air in this lower reach of the gorge was stagnant, smelling like blood on a cold bayonet. Closely Thomas Hale followed, his eyes darting toward every shadow. About the road he had stopped asking, like a memory from a different life it felt. Behind him, Silas Webb moved with a mechanical gait, his lips moving in a silent recitation of facts that no longer applied to these twisting paths. No longer soldiers they were. Intruders in a domain that did not recognize their rank or their war they were. A churning stream they reached that should have offered relief. But as they knelt to wash, Jedediah Monroe gripped Croft's arm in terror. At the water he pointed. not flowing down toward the valley it was. Instead, upward the dark, peat-stained liquid was rippling, defying gravity and crawling toward the jagged peaks, with a rhythmic pulse like blood in a vein. The stream did not splash. With a predatory grace that made the skin crawl, it slid over the rocks. Silas Webb stared, his scientific mind buckling. His tin cup he dropped, watching as uphill by the current it was carried, disappearing into the white mist. "Not right, it's..." he whispered, his voice cracking. "The mass, the gravity, broken it's..." Croft didn't answer. No logic left to offer. There was only the necessity of movement. Its impossible ascent, the water continued, a silent mockery of the world they had left behind, reminding them that on a clock and a compass not of human manufacture the mountain operated. As they pushed deeper, from wilderness into a monument, the environment changed. In a rare clearing, an ancient oak they found, its bark blistered as if struck by 1,000 lightning bolts. To its trunk dozens of military caps were nailed, Union blue and Confederate gray. To bone white some weathered, others still retaining a hint of their former color. No bodies were there, just the caps arranged in a silent, terrifying gallery. A testament it was to the many men led into these ridges by the same unseen shepherd that now watched them from the fog. To touch a faded cap, Hale reached out, but with a hissed warning, Jed pulled him back. Never to touch what belonged to the ridge, he warned the boy, for everything here has a price, and those men had paid it. To watch them as they passed the caps seemed a hollow audience of ghosts who had once marched just as they did. A constant prickling at the base of his neck the sergeant felt, the sensation of 1,000 eyes focused on his back. Frequently he turned, his hand on his revolver. But never anything but the shifting gray curtain of mist there was. Not a creature of sudden movement the watcher was. A presence in the stillness between heartbeats it was. Being herded, Croft realized they were. Too dense to penetrate in any direction, except for the one the mountain allowed the thickets were. Toward the center of the ridge they were being funneled, toward the heart of the silence they had been fleeing. Heavier every step felt, as if pulling at the iron in their blood. The ground were dragging them deeper into the earth's cold embrace. To ensure their path led only one way, the very geography was conspiring, stripping away their choices until only the path of the watcher remained open. By mid-afternoon, by charcoal clouds, the sun was swallowed. The temperature plummeted and a stinging sleet began to fall, turning the world into a mosaic of gray. In a thin layer of ice, the sleet coated their uniforms, making every movement sound like the rustling of dead leaves. At the edge of a narrow fissure they stood, a gorge within a gorge that descended into the bowels of the world. A mournful howl the wind through the crevice was like a spectral choir singing in a language that predated man. At the edge, Jedediah Monroe knelt, tracing symbols carved into the wet stone. In the deep places now they were, he whispered, where thin the skin of the world is and torn the veil is. The watcher doesn't just look at men here, he warned Croft. To the parts of the soul they hide it talks. At his men the sergeant looked. Gaunt their faces were, their eyes reflecting an ancient light. Pilgrims in a cathedral of shadow they were, waiting for a revelation they might not survive. Around their feet the mist began to thicken, curling upward like skeletal fingers, reaching for their very existence. Like entering the gullet of a great slumbering beast, the descent into the narrow fissure felt. As Sergeant Elias Croft led the way, his boots scraping against the slick, damp limestone, noticeably colder the air grew, a heavy subterranean chill that seemed to emanate from the rock itself, rather than the sky. A ghostly mist down here, the sleet that had been a stinging annoyance above became, swirling in the narrow gap between the cliffs as if stirred by invisible hands. Behind him, Thomas Hale struggled, his breathing ragged and echoing in the confined space. Like a saw cutting through dry wood, each gasp sounding. Pressing in, Croft could feel the claustrophobia, the walls of the Appalachian Gorge, narrowing until sideways they were forced to move. Their pack scraping against the ancient, fossil-embedded stone. A place where the sun had never reached. It was a sanctuary for shadows that had remained undisturbed since the dawn of time. As halfway down the crevice they reached a wider ledge, Silas Webb called out a strangled cry of disbelief. At his brass-cased compass he was staring, which in a hand that trembled with more than just the cold he held. No longer seeking the north the needle was. Instead, in slow, hypnotic circles it was spinning, clicking rhythmically against the glass, as if trying to keep time with an unheard heartbeat. The device Webb shook, his face a mask of intellectual agony, but in its impossible dance the needle remained caught. At Croft he looked, his eyes wide and hollow, seeking a rational explanation that the sergeant could not provide. The fundamental laws of the world, the varied forces that guided sailors across oceans and armies across continents, had been discarded by the mountain. No longer in the Virginia they knew they were. In a pocket of existence where the compass of man held no authority they were. In stranger ways, the psychological weight of the isolation began to manifest as they continued their downward crawl. Jedediah Monroe, usually the most stoic of the group when it came to physical hardship, stopped dead in his tracks. To a small crevice in the rock wall, he pointed where on a natural stone shelf a familiar object sat perched. A small, hand-carved wooden soldier it was, a toy that Private Hale had carried in his pocket since leaving Pennsylvania. Into his coat Hale reached, his face turning ashen as his fingers found nothing but lint. There the toy was, 10 feet deep in a fissure they had only just entered, yet as though it had been sitting in that dark hole for decades it looked, covered in a fine layer of gray dust and spider webs. No one spoke. Too terrifying to voice the implication was. Not just following them the watcher was. Ahead of them it was moving, distorting their sense of time and possession. To keep moving, Croft ordered them, his voice a low growl that lacked its usual conviction. Onto the floor of the gorge they finally spilled out, a place where in shapes that defied the natural order the trees grew. Not vertical the trunks were, but twisted into agonizing spirals, their branches interwoven so tightly that a literal roof of dead, gray wood they formed. Beneath this canopy, unnervingly still the air was. No wind here there was, yet the leaves on the ground skittered and turned as if being stepped on by 1,000 tiny, unseen feet. It was here that Jedediah finally broke the silence, a mere whisper that seemed to carry further than a shout his voice was. Of the watcher of the ridges he spoke, not as a ghost, but as a judge. In the old stories of the mountain folk, he explained, the watcher doesn't hunt the body, the spirit it weighs. The layers of a man it strips away, his rank, his pride, his memories, until only the raw truth of his soul remains. Thomas Hale was the first to see the figure again. At the edge of a dense thicket of black rhododendron, it was standing, a silhouette that was darker than the surrounding gloom. The proportions of a man it didn't have, nor the stance of an animal. Tall it was, impossibly thin,
sweet,
and draped in what looked like the tattered remains of 1,000 different fabrics. Scraps of wool, leather, and hide that blended perfectly with the bark and the shadow. Before Croft could even raise his rifle, backward the figure drifted, not running, but simply dissolving into the density of the forest. A sudden, sharp pain in his chest the sergeant felt, a realization that not for food or out of malice they were being hunted. As one might observe an insect in a jar, they were being observed, waiting to see which way it turns when the walls begin to close in. Then Sela's web began to laugh, a dry, brittle sound that made the hair on Croft's neck stand up. In the dirt, he was kneeling, tracing the patterns of the fallen leaves. The geometry of it now he claimed he could see. The way in specific sequences the trees were planted to channel their thoughts, the way to a frequency that broke the human while the sound of the stream was tuned. Not vanished his skepticism had. Inverted it had, turning into a frantic, obsessive need to find a scientific formula for their impending madness. To calculate the weight of the shadow he was trying, to measure the distance between their reality and the mountain's nightmare. By the collar, Croft grabbed him, hauling him to his feet, but distant Webb's eyes remained fixed on a horizon that through the thicket only he could see. On the group pressed, driven by a primal need to find an exit that seemed increasingly mythical. Again the forest floor began to rise, leading them toward a clearing that felt like the center of a grand, natural amphitheater. In the middle of this space a mound of earth and stone sat, topped with a single flat slab of slate. Arranged on the slate were the missing items from their trek. Webb's spectacles, the page from his journal, a single brass button from Croft's tunic, and the wooden soldier. With surgical precision they were laid out, a silent invitation or a final warning. Around the edges of the clearing the mist began to solidify, forming a wall of white that cut off their retreat. No longer behind them or beside them the watcher was. For them to acknowledge the altar they had unwittingly built with their own fear, it was waiting. At the threshold of the deep places they stood where a forgotten whisper the war of men was, and the only law that remained was the judgment of the ridges. The sinister story of Civil War soldiers. What they found in the desolate wilderness of the Appalachians. Long the gray shadows of the high ridge are, and not always to the mountain trees do they belong. Before we dive into this story, drop a comment right now telling us where you're listening from. We love knowing who's out there with us tonight. Now, let's go back to 1865. In a semicircle around the slate slab the soldiers stood, the silence of the wilderness pressing like deep water. Through his coat, Sergeant Elias Croft felt the cold moisture of the mist seeping. On the stone, with a terrifying geometric precision, the items were arranged. In the center, his own brass button sat, flanked by Silas Webb's spectacles and the page torn from the corporal's journal. Beside them, upright, the small wooden soldier that Thomas Hale had carried stood, its painted face staring blankly at the men who had failed to protect it. In this clearing no wind there was, yet occasionally the edges of the journal page fluttered, as if stirred by a breath that didn't belong to any of them. At his men Croft looked. Ashen Private Thomas Hale was, his hands buried deep in his pockets. At his glasses Corporal Silas Webb was staring with a look of profound betrayal. Seeing them here, placed upon this natural altar by an unseen hand, was a physical blow to his sanity. A low, frantic string of words about optical physics he began to murmur. But, without conviction, his voice was the sound of a man trying to talk himself out of a nightmare. It was. "A tithe it is," Jedediah Monroe whispered, his voice barely audible. With his shoulders hunched, the former Confederate deserter stood, his eyes darting toward the impenetrable wall of white mist. The old folks in the hollers about the watchers told they talked. What the mountain has claimed you don't take back. You leave it, and maybe, just maybe, it lets you pass through to the next ridge. The instinctive urge to command his men to retrieve their belongings Croft felt. Soldiers of the Union they were, and their properties these were. But as he stepped forward, to thicken the air in the clearing seemed. At the edge of the trees the shadows shifted, stretching out like long, dark fingers toward the center of the slab. Then he realized, not a theft this was, An interrogation it was. "Leave them," Croft ordered, his voice sounding foreign even to his own ears. A rasping command that defied every military regulation. It was, "We move." Now. A choked sob of relief Hale let out. But for a moment longer Webb lingered, his eyes fixed on the journal page recording their trek. As though he wanted to reach for it, he looked. But by the shoulder the sergeant grabbed him and hauled him backward. As they retreated from the clearing, almost instantly the mist seemed to swallow the altar, the white veil closing over the stone slab, as if it had never existed. Back into the forest they plunged, but once more the geography had shifted. No longer the familiar oaks and maples the trees were. Here, gnarled and blackened the trunks were, their bark peeling away in long, wet strips. So tightly the branches were interwoven they strangled the light. Spongy and unstable the ground beneath their boots was, carpeted in a layer of pale moss that seemed to glow with a faint phosphorescent light. Thomas Hale was the first to notice the change. The silence that had plagued them for days was replaced by a low, rhythmic thrumming that felt as if through the very soles of their boots it were vibrating. Not a sound heard by the ears so much as a sensation felt in the bone. It was the heartbeat of the ridge. It was ancient and slow. "Following us, it's," Hale said, stopping dead. Back toward the way they had come he pointed. Croft turned, his rifle raised. At first, nothing but the twisted trunks and the shifting curtains of fog he saw. Then he saw it. In the middle of their trail the watcher was standing, perhaps 50 paces back. Tall and thin it stood, its silhouette a jagged tear in the fabric of the forest. In a chaotic mantle of gray and brown rags it was draped, scraps of fabric collected from past decades. No face there was, only a dark, hollow space where a head should be, framed by a crown of tangled briars. The figure didn't move. It didn't threaten. Simply it observed. A wave of nausea Croft felt wash over him. Not just a physical presence he realized the watcher was. A mirror it was. In its stillness, the reflection of his own exhaustion he saw. To look away from the figure Croft forced himself. By the collar he grabbed Webb and hauled him to his feet with desperate strength. They couldn't stay. Deeper into the ridges they had to move. To run they began, slipping on moss, gasping for air. Behind them, louder the low thrumming of the mountain grew, a vibration that seemed to be cheering their flight. No longer soldiers they were. Prey in a sanctuary that had forgotten the meaning of mercy. They were driven by a fear that had no name, but possessed 1,000 ancient faces. Against the yielding earth the soldiers' boots thudded, a frantic rhythm matching their hammering hearts. Thick the air in this pocket of the Appalachians had grown, tasting of ancient rot and wet stone. A labor every breath was a heavy draft of mist that from the inside out chilled the lungs. The way Sergeant Elias Croft led, his gaze fixed forward, though to the image of the figure standing behind them his mind was anchored. The Watcher, a silent sentinel of a world predating the maps of men. He didn't look back. To acknowledge the impossible was to look back, granting the shadow a power over his soul. He was not ready to surrender. Behind him, a series of ragged gasps. Thomas Hale's breathing was flagging. The boy was, his strength stripped by hunger and the pressure of the unseen. Next came Silas Webb, whose movements, no longer those of a disciplined soldier, were but the instinctive flailing of a creature caught in a snare. The rear Jedidiah Monroe brought up, his eyes roaming, his lips moving in a silent prayer, or warding charms learned in the sunless hollows of his youth. Around their small group the forest seemed to tighten. The gnarled trees, their bark like charred flesh, leaned inward as if listening to their passage. Deeper the low thrumming that had begun at the altar grew, a vibration rattling the brass buttons on their uniforms and the bayonets at their hips. The sound of the mountain's clock it was, ticking in centuries rather than seconds. A terrifying realization Croft felt. Not running toward safety they were. Funneled they were being. Amazed the landscape was, and the architect the watcher was, shifting walls of fog to guide them toward a destination they had no part in choosing. A stop Croft finally commanded, his voice a hoarse croak. A jagged ravine they had reached, a vertical drop into a sea of white vapor hiding the bottom. Simply ended the path they followed, severed by a geological scar that looked torn open by a giant's hand. The men collapsed, huddling for a warmth the damp air refused to provide. With his head in his hands, Webb sat, fingers digging into his scalp. "Here it shouldn't be," he whispered. "No gorge of this magnitude in this quadrant the maps show. A physical impossibility it is, Elias. A valley of this depth by the scouts years ago would have been recorded." With weary acceptance, Monroe looked at him. Into the dark woods they had just fled he stared. What we're seeing the scouts didn't see, sealess. Trees and dirt they saw. The bones of the world we're seeing. Off the map we've stepped. This ain't Virginia, and it ain't Tennessee. The watcher's porch it is, and the uninvited guests who forgot to knock we're. Gaunt in the twilight his face, Hale looked up. For us tonight will it come. The thing in the rags. Just stood there it did. A face it didn't have, Sarge. I looked, and just a hole in the air there was. His rifle Croft checked. A meager comfort the weight providing. Damp the powder was, the flint worn. Like a toy here his weapon felt, a relic of a civilization that held no jurisdiction over these ridges. What it is we don't know, Croft said, trying to regain his command, but against us it hasn't moved yet. Our things it took, but our lives it left us. Our eyes we keep open, turns watching the tree line we take. Back Webb snapped, his voice brittle. For what watching? A ghost, a collective hallucination. Tell me, Sergeant, a shadow, how do we shoot? A mountain that moves its own trees, how do we outrun? Croft didn't answer. Over the ravine he looked, watching mist swirl in the depths. Coiled and pulsed it, mimicking shapes that shouldn't exist. Towering spires and arched bridges of bone. Louder now, the thrumming in the ground was a heavy beat coming from directly beneath their boots. Not hunting them like a wolf, the sergeant realized the watcher was. Observing them it was, testing the integrity of their minds. The war they had left behind, with its cannons and cavalry charges, seemed like a distant dream compared to the chaotic silence of this wilderness. Out there, for causes, for flags, or for pieces of dirt, men died. Here, unmade they were being, their identities stripped away until only the raw, shivering core of their humanity remained. Tighter Croft gripped his rifle. Waiting for them to break, he wondered if the watcher was, or waiting for them to finally understand the language of the ridges it was. A language written in silence and shadow, older than the Republic and indifferent to the fate of any soldier wandering into its heart. With an oppressive weight, night fell, light being sucked from the sky. The stars did not appear. Instead, absolute the darkness was, save for the unsettling glow of the moss and sparks of static dancing along the barrels of their rifles. An ethereal, sickly green light the bioluminescent moss cast upon the faces of the men, making them look like specters already departed from the living world. This dim radiance their eyes reflected, wide and glass-like, devoid of the spark of hope that usually sustained a soldier in the field. On the edge of the abyss 4 men sat alone, while from the trees the ancient guardian watched, patient and eternal. As the blackness deepened, the forest sounds changed. Joined the thrumming was by a sound like dry parchment rubbing together, the rustle of the watcher's tattered mantle moving through the underbrush. A cold chill Croft felt. The realization it was that no longer a mission their journey was. but a pilgrimage into the unknown, and yet to be fully paid the price of passage had. Not empty the silence that followed was. Heavy with the expectation of the mountain it was. A vast and ancient patience that seemed to be waiting for a single word, or a final surrender. No longer the hunters they were, and no longer the scouts of a great army they were. Merely witnesses to a power that did not care for the politics of men, or the boundaries of nations they were. A power that upon their suffering looked with the cold, unblinking eye of the stones themselves. For a moment Croft closed his eyes, but burned into his retinas the image of the faceless thing in the woods remained. A reminder that never meant to be crossed some boundaries were. The sinister story of Civil War soldiers, what they found in the desolate wilderness of the Appalachians. Not merely drift the mist did, it breathed. A slow and rhythmic exhalation from the very lungs of the mountain that seemed to savor the scent of their fear. Before we dive into this story, drop a comment right now telling us where you're listening from. What city? What state? What country? We love knowing who's out there with us tonight. Now let's go back to 1865. To the edge of the jagged ravine the soldiers clung, as if the crumbling soil were the last tether to a reality that was rapidly dissolving. In the soles of his boots, Sergeant Elias Croft felt the heavy vibration. A rhythmic thrumming that felt less like a sound and more like the beating heart of the earth itself. A subterranean pulse it was, ancient and indifferent to the four men shivering in the damp shadows. A sickly emerald pallor over the group, the bioluminescent moss clinging to the wet rock faces cast, transforming their worn Union uniforms into the tattered shrouds of ghosts. Against the air, every breath they took was a struggle, which had grown thick and heavy, laden with the metallic tang of static and the ancient smell of damp earth and rot. No longer a theater of war, the Appalachian wilderness was. A cathedral of the unknown it had become, and the unwilling acolytes at its altar they were. With his back against a weeping stone, Corporal Silas Webb sat, his fingers clutching a pencil that in his pocket had long since snapped. To a man of logic, a man who had taught the rigid laws of geometry and physics to children in a brick schoolhouse, a waking nightmare of impossible dimensions this place was. A physical contradiction the gorge before them was. According to the topographical surveys he had studied, in this region no such rift existed. To roll and fold the mountains were supposed, not break open into bottomless abysses that swallowed the very stars. Once his greatest weapon, Webb's mind was now a fractured mirror reflecting only the absurdity of their situation. To himself he whispered, reciting the names of Virginian counties and the dates of great battles. A desperate attempt to anchor his consciousness to the world. He understood. But for names or dates the mountain did not care. Only for the weight of their intrusion it cared. Eroding the mathematical certainty he once held was replaced by the terrifying realization that some parts of the world refused to be measured or mapped. Jedediah Monroe watched the tree line with the weary, hollowed-out eyes of a man who had seen the veil between worlds pulled back. No longer a matter of military reconnaissance, he knew that their presence here was a boundary that was never meant for the living they had crossed. A threshold whereby the whims of the watcher the rules of men were replaced. In low, gravelly tones he spoke about the watcher's porch, a place where the worth of the souls that dared to trespass the mountain judged. According to the whispers of his ancestors, no longer in the south or the north were those who reached this high ridge. In the in between they were, a liminal space where irrelevant the past and the future were. To Monroe, not a monster to be fought the watcher was, but a force of nature to be endured, like a winter storm or a rising flood. Once mocked by Webb, His superstitions were now the only map they had left, though a map of shadows and warnings rather than paths and rivers it was. In his hand he clutched a small, smooth river stone, a charm against the things that walked in the gray light. Beside him, a portrait of shattered innocence young Thomas Hale was. On the darkness where he had seen the faceless figure, the boy's gaze was fixed. As a hole in the air, he described it, a void that moved with a terrifying grace. Enough to age him the trauma of the war had been, but his very essence this experience was stripping away. No longer he asked about when they would return to Pennsylvania, or what they would eat. To the immediate proximity of the sergeant, and the terrifying certainty that by something that didn't possess a human heart, they were being evaluated, his world had narrowed. Worse than the roar of a cannonade, the silence of the woods was. In the silence, from the realization of their own insignificance, no distraction there was. Closer to the dying embers of their resolve he huddled, his hands shaking with a cold that no fire could ever reach. His Springfield rifle Croft gripped, the wood slick with condensation. At the brass buttons on his coat he looked, now tarnished and dull, and realized how hollow the symbols of his rank had become. In the army, a leader of men he was, a veteran of horrific skirmishes and long marches. Here, merely the eldest among the lost, he was a shepherd of 3 terrified souls in a pasture of ghosts. Louder the thrumming in the ground grew, a deep bass note that seemed to vibrate his very teeth. Along the iron barrels of their rifles, small sparks of blue static electricity began to dance. A phenomenon that should have been fascinating, but instead deeply ominous was, as if charging the atmosphere itself were preparing for a revelation that their minds were not equipped to handle. The percussion caps on his weapon he checked, knowing full well that against the shifting walls of the gorge lead and powder were useless. Unmade they were being. The only word Croft could find for it, that was. The identities they had forged in the fire of the Civil War. The soldier, the teacher, the farm boy, the deserter, were being peeled away like layers of dead skin. Peeling them back, the watcher was to see what remained underneath. Were they men of courage, or merely animals driven by a fear of the dark? Were they? A crucible the mountain was, and rising the heat was. The strength to remain whole. Croft wondered if any of them would have, or if to the chaotic silence of the ridges, they would all eventually succumb. The war they had left behind seemed like a petty squabble between children compared to the vast, cold eternity that surrounded them now. Nothing to the stones and the fog flags and borders meant. The only thing that mattered was the breath in their lungs and the increasingly fragile tether of their sanity. Returning the sound of dry parchment rubbing together, drifting on a wind that shouldn't have existed in the sheltered ravine. The sound of the watcher's mantle it was, a tattered shroud of centuries moving through the underbrush. Watched they were being, not with malice, but with a clinical, ancient patience. Witnesses now the soldiers were, not to history, but to a reality that predated the very concept of man. Clear as throat, as over them the absolute darkness of the Appalachian night settled, heavy as a burial shroud. Yet to be demanded, Croft realized that the price of their passage had. For the mountain to speak they were waiting, and when it did, never be the same again, they knew their lives would. The emerald glow of the moss flickered against the ravine wall, casting long distorted shadows, making it appear as though shifting the rocks themselves were closing in to finalize their isolation from the world of the living. His eyes Croft closed, praying for a dawn that felt like it might never come. While on the ridge the unseen guardian tightened its invisible grip, watching the flickering sparks of their humanity fade into the blackness. The sinister story of Civil War soldiers, what they found in the desolate wilderness of the Appalachians. Not forget the mountains do, and certainly not forgive those who step where long since flickered out the light of God has. Before we dive into this story, drop a comment right now telling us where you're listening from. What city? What state? What country? We love knowing who's out there with us tonight. Now let's go back to 1865. With the traditional fanfare of a rising sun, the morning didn't arrive. Instead, as a slow, agonizing transition from total darkness to a suffocating bruised purple, it manifested. Thick enough to taste the air, was flavored with the mineral tang of wet slate and the cloying scent of ancient, undisturbed rot. As still as the trees surrounding him, Sergeant Elias Croft stood, his muscles locked in a permanent state of tension that mere fatigue had long since transcended. His men he watched, or what remained of them. As in the gray sludge of the ravine, they struggled to find their feet. Less like soldiers of the Union they looked, and more like specters unearthed from a shallow grave. In the dark, heavy clay of the Appalachians, their uniforms were caked, and masks of soot and terror their faces were. A chore every movement was a battle against the damp chill that into their bones during the long, haunted night had settled every breath. The most distressing to behold Corporal Silas Webb was the man who had once been a pillar of intellectual certainty, a man who could explain the mechanics of a steam engine or the movement of the tides, to a state of catatonic observation, was now reduced. By the dead fire he sat, his fingers tracing the frayed edges of his coat, as if trying to remember the tactile sensation of reality. For 34 years, the logic that had served him had proven insufficient against the mountain's architecture. According to the maps, he had memorized the gorge they had spent the night in should not have existed. Yet here they were, trapped in a geographic anomaly that seemed to pulse with a low, rhythmic heartbeat. Wide Webb's eyes were, the pupils blown as if trying to take in more light than the environment was willing to provide. No longer a teacher he was, of a much darker, older curriculum that ignored the laws of man. He was a student. Among them, Jedediah Monroe moved with the quiet grace of a man who had accepted his own death. In hushed, gravelly tones, he spoke about the altar of the ridges, a place where the tolls of the living, the watcher, collected. No longer on the soil of Tennessee or Virginia they were, he explained to Croft. In the throat of the mountain itself they were. To Monroe, not an abstract concept the supernatural was, but a neighbor, a force that required respect and a specific kind of silence. To the trees he pointed, noting how with symbols that mirrored the ones they had seen in the abandoned settlement, the bark seemed to be scarred. Not marks of a language meant for human eyes these were, but boundary markers for something far more territorial and ancient. Not hunting them for meat, he warned them, that the watcher was, but for their very essence, testing the strength of their spirits against the weight of the wilderness. As out of the ravine they began their ascent, to their movement the forest seemed to react. Absolute the silence was, a heavy, ringing void that pressed against their eardrums. No birds were there. No squirrels, not even the rustle of a breeze through the high canopy. The only sound was the rhythmic thud of their boots and the ragged gasps of their breath. Thomas Hale, the youngest among them, walked in a trance-like state, held loosely at his side his Springfield rifle. He was the first to notice the change in the vegetation. The mountain laurel, which in the late winter chill should have been dormant, was twisted and vibrant, its waxy leaves shimmering with a faint, iridescent film. For them the briars seemed to reach, their thorns like iron hooks that snagged on their wool coats, pulling them toward the center of the ridge. Soft the path beneath them felt, almost like skin, as if breathing beneath their feet the mountain itself were. By the time at its zenith the sun should have been, though a uniform sheet of leaden gray the sky remained, a plateau they reached that felt like the roof of the world. Suddenly the trees vanished, giving way to a wide, circular clearing that was unnaturally level. In the center of this space sat the rock formation Monroe had hinted at. A primitive shrine it was, a cairn of smooth, black stones that nearly 6 ft into the air rose. By a complex web of woven roots and animal sinew it was held together. But it was the items tucked into the stones that made Croft's heart stutter. A museum of the missing it was. A rusted cavalry saber he saw, its hilt wrapped in a tattered Union sash. A pair of spectacles he saw, their glass cracked, but still reflecting the dull light. Buttons there were, locks of hair tied with string, a child's leather shoe, and a stack of letters so weathered they had become a single, pulpy mass. Not a place of slaughter this was, but a place of collection. A life that had been diverted into these woods and never returned, each item represented. From the current war there were artifacts, certainly, but beneath them were objects that looked a century old. Hand-forged nails, pewter spoons, and fragments of flintlock rifles. For a long time the Watcher had been here, and vast its harvest was. At the edge of the shrine Silas Webb collapsed to his knees, his hand reaching out to touch a small, silver locket that from a protruding root dangled. He didn't scream. A low, mournful sound he simply let out, the sound of a man who finally understands the scale of his own insignificance in the face of eternity. Then, the air in the clearing curdled. A shadow, deeper and more solid than the mist, detached itself from the tree line. The Watcher it was. Nearly 7 feet tall it stood, its form draped in a heavy, tattered cloak that appeared to be made of living moss and shadows. No face it had, only a smooth, gray expanse where features should have been. Yet, overwhelming the sensation of being watched was. Toward them it didn't move, but the pressure in the air increased until like his lungs were being squeezed by a giant's hand. Croft felt. A guardian the figure was, an ancient sentinel of the ridges, and waiting it was. Then Croft realized they could not fight this presence. You cannot shoot the wind or bayonet the fog. Into his pocket he reached and pulled out his sergeant's whistle, the one that at Cold Harbor had signaled the charge. Forward he stepped, his legs trembling, and on the flat stone at the base of the cairn placed the brass whistle. A surrender it was. Following his lead, his skinning knife Monroe dropped, and a small, carved wooden cross Hale left behind. Even to unpin his corporal stripes and lay them on the stones Webb managed. As the last item was placed, to dissolve the figure in the trees seemed. Away it didn't walk. Into the gray background of the forest it simply faded. The suffocating pressure lifted, and for the first time in days, to blow the wind began. Not a word Croft said. By the shoulder he grabbed Webb, hauling him to his feet, and for the others to follow gestured. On the shrine and the Watcher they turned their backs, heading toward a gap in the trees that moments before hadn't been there, praying they were finally being allowed to leave. The sinister story of Civil War soldiers, what they found in the desolate wilderness of the Appalachians. Not merely secrets the mountains hold, memories that have outlived the civilizations that once tried to tame them they hold, breathing through the stone and the fog as if nothing more than a passing breeze time itself were. Before we dive into this story, drop a comment right now telling us where you're listening from. What city? What state? What country? We love knowing who's out there with us tonight. Now let's go back to 1865. Like a mouth that had finally chosen to spit them out rather than swallow them, hold the jagged opening in the timberline felt. Sergeant Elias Croft did not hesitate, pushing Corporal Silas Webb forward with a strength born of pure military discipline. Through the threshold they moved, leaving behind the shrine of the missing and the heavy, faceless gaze of the watcher. As into the shadow of the dense hemlocks they stepped, the atmosphere shifted. The suffocating rhythmic pressure that against their temples had pulsed since they entered the gorge began to ebb, replaced by a hollow ringing silence that somehow more haunting was. The silence of a void. It was a space where its interrogation the mountain had finished. Instinctively to his pocket Croft's hand went, searching for the brass whistle that since the carnage of Cold Harbor had been his constant companion. But only lint and the rough wool of his trousers his fingers found. A physical ache the loss was, a phantom limb that with every step throbbed. A piece of his identity for their lives he had traded, and heavier than any pack he had ever carried the weight of that bargain felt. Behind him, like a marionette with its strings cut, Silas Webb moved. Gone the man who had once been able to name every rock and calculate the trajectory of a bullet was. On the mud beneath his boots his eyes remained fixed, his lips occasionally twitching, as if trying to recite a formula that no longer applied to a world where shadows could stand 7 feet tall and dissolve into the mist. His shield Webb's logic had been, and the watcher had shattered it. A scholar who had looked into the sun and come away blind, he was, his mind unable to reconcile his textbooks with the ancient reality of the Appalachians. Beside him, with a strange, glassy-eyed reverence, Thomas Hale walked. With a grace that was not his own, the young private moved, his feet finding purchase on slippery roots and loose shale with an ease that suggested he was being guided. At the trees he did not look, for to know it was there he no longer needed to see the watcher. In the wind and the shadows he felt the entity's presence. To Hale, no longer a squad, they were a procession of ghosts being escorted to the border of the living world. They were the only one who seemed to understand the mechanics of their survival. Jedediah Monroe was. Low he kept his head, rhythmic and deliberate his movements, his gaze never wandering far from the path that before them had miraculously appeared. In a low, gravelly whisper that was meant only for the earth he spoke, a series of apologies and acknowledgments in a dialect that sounded older than the war they were supposedly fighting. About the altar he had warned them, and now that they had paid the toll, by the need to maintain the sanctity of their departure, he seemed consumed. For them to remain silent he signaled, his hand cutting through the air whenever against the frozen leaves someone's boots crunched too loudly. A fragile thing he knew that the mountain's mercy was a temporary reprieve that at any moment could be rescinded if the slightest bit of disrespect they showed, or if to look back at the abyss they had just escaped they dared. No longer just a collection of trees and stones, the wilderness around them was a living, breathing witness it was, and the intruders who had been granted a narrow window of escape they were. As from the high plateau they descended, its surreal quality the terrain began to lose. The mountain laurel, once vibrant and pulsing with an unnatural iridescence, faded back into the drab, dormant browns and grays of late winter. Sharper the air grew, the biting cold of the March wind returning with a vengeance that their exposed skin stung. A cruel, familiar pain it was, and Croft welcomed it. A sensation that belonged to the world of men. It was a world where the primary enemies were hunger and frostbite, not the ancient guardians of the high ridges. A small, fast, moving stream they found that a jagged path through a limestone gorge cut, its water clear and freezing. Following the flow was an instinct older than their military training, a fundamental rule of survival that finally applicable again felt. Through the shallows they waded, their boots filling with icy water, but no one complained. A tether to reality, the physical discomfort was a way to anchor their drifting minds back to the simple. brutal task of putting one foot in front of the other, into a long, gray twilight that seemed to stretch for an eternity. The day bled. They did not stop to rest, for more potent than the exhaustion that threatened to collapse their lungs, the fear of the shadows catching up to them was. Like scavengers, they moved through the deepening gloom, their uniforms tattered and their spirits broken, yet by a primal urge to see a horizon that wasn't jagged with the peaks of the Appalachians driven. With a grim determination, Croft led them, his eyes scanning the tree line for any sign of a man-made structure. A fence post or the faint indentation of an old logging trail. Close to the edge of the wilderness they were. And the way the pressure in his chest was slowly beginning to lift, he could feel it. But never truly leave this place. He also knew that they would. In their marrow, they would carry the silence of the ridges and into the back of their eyelids. For as long as they lived, the image of the faceless watcher would be burned. The survivors of a war that had no name, they were soldiers who in the mountains had found something that the history books would never acknowledge, and a burden that would eventually crush them. All the weight of that secret was. As through the heavy cloud cover the first stars began to peer, Croft saw it, a small, collapsed stone chimney standing like a tombstone in a tangle of briars. A ruin it was, but a human ruin it was. The first sign of civilization in days. It was a marker of a world where men built things to last, however futilely. There they stopped, huddling together in the lee of the cold stone, not to sleep, but for the dawn that would finally carry them home to wait. The sinister story of Civil War soldiers, what they found in the desolate wilderness of the Appalachians. The dying embers of the fire hissed as upon the ruined stone chimney the morning frost settled, a skeletal remains of a life long forgotten by the world. Before we dive into this story, drop a comment right now telling us where you're listening from. What city? What state? What country? We love knowing who's out there with us tonight. Now let's go back to 1865. Not with the warmth of salvation, the dawn that finally crested the jagged peaks of the Appalachian Range arrived, but with a cold, clinical clarity that stripped away the last vestiges of the men's illusions. Among the frost-covered briars, Sergeant Elias Croft stood, his body aching with a fatigue that seemed to reach into his very marrow. At his 3 remaining companions he looked, clearly for the first time since they had entered the high ridges, seeing them. Ghosts in blue wool they were, their faces hollowed out by hunger and a terror that transcended the simple violence of the battlefield. Their pride, their logic, and their certainty the mountain had taken, leaving behind only the raw instinct to survive. As the gray light spread, for them to move, Croft signaled. No orders left to give. There were no military objectives to secure. Only the singular, desperate goal of finding a world where the trees did not watch and the shadows did not breathe. There was. By midday, the first signs of the living world they found. Half hidden by dead leaves and mud, a rutted wagon track it was, but unmistakably the work of men. With a mechanical, stumbling gait they followed it, their eyes fixed on Eerie in Virginia, as if afraid that looking up would invite the wilderness to reclaim them. When a local farmer hauling a load of timber, they finally encountered his team of oxen, the man stopped and stared at them with an expression of profound pity. Who they were, or what regiment they served, he did not ask. The state of their uniforms and the haunted vacancy in their eyes told a story that needed no words. Salt pork and a skin of weak cider he offered them, which in a silence so heavy it seemed to dampen the sound of the wind they consumed. To these soldiers, a holy rite, the simple act of chewing food that had been grown in a sunlit field, felt like a slow reconnection to a reality they had nearly surrendered. By the time a Union outpost Near the Virginia border they reached. Through the ranks the news of the war's end was already filtering. Retreating Lee was, and drawing to a close the long, bloody nightmare of the rebellion was. For most soldiers a time of jubilation this was, but for Croft's men, distant and inconsequential, the geopolitical fate of the nation felt. Through the medical tents like casualties of a forgotten skirmish, they were processed. For wounds of the flesh the surgeons looked and found none. Yet at every rustle of the canvas tent they noted the way Corporal Silas Webb flinched, and how toward the distant mountains, with a look of profound mournful recognition, Private Thomas Hale spent his hours staring. Survivors they were, but not whole they were. Upon them the wilderness had left its mark, a spiritual scar that no peace treaty could ever heal. Corporal Silas Webb was the first to succumb to the weight of what they had witnessed. The man who had once found comfort in the rigid laws of mathematics and the predictable nature of the physical world found himself unable to return to his life as a teacher. In the abandoned settlement, the logic he had once wielded as a shield had been shattered. In a quiet house in Ohio, surrounded by books he no longer read, he spent the remainder of his days. For hours in a darkened room he would sit, his eyes fixed on the corners where the shadows pooled, convinced that merely a thin veil over something ancient and hungry the geometry of the world was. To no one of the watcher he spoke, for to name the thing was to admit that a lie his precious reason was. In his sleep a decade later he died, his face frozen in an expression of intense, focused listening. To the rolling hills of Pennsylvania, Private Thomas Hale returned, but never truly the ridges of the Appalachians he left. A man of few words he became, a farmer who with a quiet, reverent intensity worked his land. Years after the war, to write a letter to a younger cousin who had expressed a desire to explore the Western territories, he sat down. In that letter, the only written record of their ordeal, Hale wrote that a guardian the mountains had, and not out of mercy, but out of a dark, inscrutable curiosity it had let them go. Not as a monster he described the watcher, but as a witness to the folly of men, an entity that long before the first surveyor's line was drawn had existed, and long after the last city fell to ruin would remain. Never to seek the high places where the mist never lifts, he warned his kin, for some doors, once opened, can never be fully closed. Jedediah Monroe, the man who had provided the folklore and the warnings to see the fruits of the peace, did not stay. A few months after the surrender at Appomattox, away from his encampment he simply walked. Among the veterans there were rumors that back toward the deep gorges of the Tennessee border, he had been seen heading carrying nothing but a knife and a small pouch of tobacco. To the war some said he had lost his mind, while others whispered that in the ritual clearing, he had made a pact and to fulfill his end of the bargain had gone. Into the green canopy of the mountains he vanished, becoming another legend in a land that already thick with them was. Whether peace he found or part of the shadow itself became, is a question that only the ridges can answer. Sergeant Elias Croft lived the longest, until his final breath, carrying the burden of leadership. Of the mission he never spoke, and the brass whistle he had left upon the stone altar he never used. A man who had looked into the abyss and survived by offering it a piece of his soul he was. In his final years, as the sun set on his porch, he would often stand, his gaze fixed on the darkening horizon. Of the thousands of men who during those 4 years of blood and fire had marched into the wilderness, he thought, the boys who had simply vanished into the fog, leaving behind no graves and no stories, not all taken by bullets or disease, he knew now that they weren't. Simply stepped off the map of the known world and into the waiting arms of the watcher some had. In the ink of casualty lists, and the dust of battlefields, the story of the Civil War, is written. But there are chapters that remain unread, tucked away in the silent, suffocating depths of the Appalachians. For the causes of men, the mountains do not care, nor do they recognize the borders drawn by generals. A realm of ancient stone and eternal shadow they are, where patient and unblinking the watcher remains, waiting for the next group of wanderers to stray too far from the path. As through the high ridges tonight the wind howls, it carries the echoes of 1865, a reminder that the wilderness never truly forgets those who dare to trespass within its heart. Some secrets are meant to stay buried in the mist, where the only witness is the cold, indifferent eye of the peaks. This has been THE Last ETR Night Y. Subscribe now so you don't miss more videos like this one. Drop a comment telling us where you're listening from. What city? What state? What country? We love knowing who's out there with us tonight. Until next time, keep your eyes on the tree line.